I've worked the night shift at McDonald's for about 2 years now, and I've seen some pretty weird stuff. You wouldn't believe the kinds of people who roll in at 2 or 3 in the morning. Drunk college kids, truck drivers, you name it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened last night. It was a Thursday, and Thursday nights are usually dead. People save their craziness for the weekends. Around 1:30 a.m., the place was quiet. The last customer had gone, leaving the restaurant empty except for me and a guy named Mike who worked the grill in the back. We were both looking forward to an easy night. I was behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, half paying attention to the monitor for drive-through orders. Mike was messing around in the back, probably cleaning or something. Then, the first weird thing happened. The lights flickered. It was just a moment, but long enough for me to look up. "Did you see that?" I called back to Mike. He peeked his head out from the kitchen. "See what?" "The lights just flickered. Probably the wind or something." "This place is a piece of crap." He shrugged and disappeared back behind the grill. I didn't think much of it either. The lights here were always a bit wonky. It's an old building, and management never really cared about fixing anything unless it was completely broken. But then the drive-through monitor beeped. An order popped up. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There wasn't any car outside. I had a clear view of the drive-through lane, and it was empty. Still, the order was right there on the screen. 1 black coffee, no cream, no sugar. I thought maybe it was a glitch, but I figured I'd play along. "You want to make a coffee?" I yelled back at Mike. "Yeah, sure," he replied without looking up. I waited for a few more minutes, still staring out at the empty lane. No one ever pulled up. After 5 minutes, I decided to cancel the order from the system and toss the coffee in the sink. A few minutes later, the same order popped up again. 1 black coffee, no cream, no sugar. This time I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I checked the cameras. Nothing, not a single car in sight. The drive-through lane was deserted, and the street beyond it was completely empty. I called Mike over, feeling uneasy. "Dude, check this out." Mike walked up to the monitor and frowned. "That's creepy. You see anything outside?" He looked through the windows, then checked the cameras. "Nope, nada." We stood there in silence for a moment. Then the order beeped a third time. 1 black coffee, no cream, no sugar. Now Mike was freaked out too. "What the hell?" "I don't know, man," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not making another coffee for a ghost." We canceled the order again, and everything seemed to calm down for a bit. But we were both on edge now. We didn't talk much, and I kept checking the cameras obsessively. At around 3 a.m., the front door chimed. We hadn't heard anyone come in, but the door definitely swung open. Mike and I both jumped, staring at the door as it creaked slowly, the bell attached to it making a low, unsettling jingle. But no one was there. I'm done with this place," Mike muttered, backing away from the counter. Suddenly the sound of the fryer bubbled loudly, as if someone had thrown a batch of fries in. But neither of us had touched it. I walked slowly over to the fryer, dread creeping up my spine. The oil was boiling, popping angrily, but the basket was empty. Just then, a voice deep and gravelly came over the drive-through speaker. "Black coffee, no cream, no sugar." My stomach dropped. I froze, staring at the speaker like it might come to life and crawl off the wall. "Mike, did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm not going out there, man." We both stood there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Black coffee, no cream, no sugar." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and bolted toward the door. "Screw this, I'm out." But as soon as I touched the door handle, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The entire restaurant plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of the fryers and the buzzing red glow of the drive-through monitor. I heard Mike whisper behind me, "Don't leave me, man." Before I could respond, the front door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The windows rattled in their frames, and the temperature in the restaurant plummeted. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The fryers started bubbling again, this time more violently. And then we heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the kitchen. They were getting closer. "Mike, we have to get out of here," I whispered. But before we could move, the footsteps stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe whatever was happening had stopped. But then I saw it. A figure. Dark, shadowy, standing just beyond the counter in the kitchen. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its head seemed to brush the ceiling. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it staring at us. Mike started to hyperventilate. What? What is that? I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. Just don't move. The figure stood still for a moment longer, and then in a raspy voice it spoke. Black coffee, no cream, no sugar. I felt like I was going to pass out. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The figure started to move again, slowly gliding toward us, its footsteps silent now. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to do something. I grabbed a nearby broom, holding it out like some kind of makeshift weapon. But as the figure came closer, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. The restaurant was silent again, except for the low hum of the appliances. Mike and I stood there for what felt like hours, neither of us saying a word. Eventually, I managed to gather the courage to check the cameras one last time. I wish I hadn't. The drive-through camera showed a man standing just outside the window. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, his face pale and gaunt, and in his hand, he held a steaming cup of black coffee. No cream, no sugar. Mike whispered beside me, staring at the screen. That was the last straw. We both quit that night, never looking back. I've worked at McDonald's for about 6 months, and the late-night shifts are the worst. Not just because they're boring, but because weird stuff happens when the sun goes down. I used to think the stories other night shift workers told were just meant to scare newbies like me. But after what I experienced last week, I know better. It was a Tuesday night, and like most weeknights, it was dead. The occasional car would roll through the drive-thru, but for the most part, it was just me, my coworker Samantha, and the sound of the ice machine humming in the background. Around 2 a.m., things started to get strange. Samantha was in the back cleaning, and I was standing by the counter, scrolling through my phone when I heard a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but it got louder. Then I realized it was coming from the play place. Now, the play place is closed at night. We don't get many kids around that time, and to be honest, it always creeped me out. The lights in there are dim, and the way the tubes twist and turn makes it feel like something could be hiding around every corner. I walked over to the door that led to the play place, my heart beating a little faster. The tapping stopped as soon as I got close. I stood there for a moment, staring through the glass window, trying to see if anyone had somehow snuck in. But it was empty, just the colorful tubes in the ball pit. Shrugging it off, I returned to my spot behind the counter. I figured it was just the wind or maybe something settling in the building. But not even 5 minutes later, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. "Sam, you hear that?" I called out. She popped her head out from the back, wiping her hands on a rag. "Hear what?" "That tapping sound." She walked over, frowning. "I don't hear anything." Just as the words left her mouth, we both heard it, a loud, unmistakable bang, like something hitting the glass door of the play place. We jumped, and Samantha turned pale. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I'm going to check it out." I grabbed my flashlight from under the counter and made my way back to the play place. The glass door was rattling slightly, as if someone had just hit it. I shined the light through the window, scanning the area. Still nothing. No movement, no people, just the empty play place. I opened the door and stepped inside, the smell of stale fries and plastic instantly filling my nose. The tubes and slides loomed above me like some kind of twisted, colorful jungle. I shined the flashlight around, checking the corners, making sure no one was hiding. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard it, soft, almost like a whisper. It was coming from the ball pit. "Sam?" I called out, my voice shaking a little. "Yeah?" She responded from behind the counter. "I think there's something in the ball pit." "What do you mean, something?" she asked, clearly freaked out. I took a deep breath and moved toward the pit. The plastic balls shimmered under the flashlight's beam. For a moment I just stood there, staring, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then I saw it. Movement. The balls shifted, like something underneath was moving through them. "Holy crap," I whispered. I dropped the flashlight, the beam flickering as it rolled across the floor. I turned to run, but before I could move, something cold grabbed my ankle. I screamed, kicking and flailing, trying to shake it off. The grip was tight, icy, like a hand made of ice was squeezing me. "Help! Sam!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Samantha came rushing in, eyes wide with panic. She grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the door. I could feel whatever had me starting to let go, but just as I thought I was free, I glanced back at the ball pit. A face stared back at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile. The thing didn't move, but its eyes followed me as I scrambled to my feet. Samantha pulled me out of the play place, slamming the door behind us. We both collapsed behind the counter, gasping for breath. Did you see that?" I stammered. "I don't know what I saw," she whispered, shaking her head, "but we need to get out of here." We grabbed our things and ran out the back door. I didn't even bother clocking out. I just wanted to get as far away from that play place as possible. As we sped off in Samantha's car, I looked back at the restaurant. For a moment, I thought I saw something, someone standing in the play place window, watching us leave. The next day I called in sick. I couldn't bring myself to go back. Samantha quit that same day, refusing to ever set foot in that McDonald's again. I don't know what's in that play place, but I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself working a late shift at McDonald's, stay away from the play place. You never know what might be waiting for you inside. I've been working the late night shift at McDonald's for about a year now, and it's mostly uneventful. You get the occasional drunk college kid, maybe a group of teenagers coming back from a party, but it's never anything serious. Until last week. It was a Wednesday just after midnight. The place was dead, as it usually is midweek. My coworker Jenny was in the back cleaning up the fry station, and I was up front, leaning against the counter and scrolling through my phone. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until I could go home. Nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I saw him. A man came through the front door, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't like the usual late-night crowd, no drunk stumbling or tired shuffling. He was tall, probably around 6 feet, with a thin build. His clothes were strange too. He wore an old-fashioned brown coat, long and worn, the kind you'd see in black and white films. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes were dark, set deep into his skull like he hadn't slept in days. "Welcome to McDonald's," I said, trying to sound normal, but something about him was unsettling. "What can I get for you?" He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring at the menu board as if he couldn't decide. The silence stretched on for an uncomfortable amount of time. Finally he spoke. "I'll take a burger," he said, his voice slow and raspy, like he hadn't used it in a while. "No cheese, just meat and bread." I punched in the order and gave him the total. He didn't move right away, just stared at me with those deep, sunken eyes before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled bill. He handed it to me without a word, his hand cold and clammy against mine. "Okay," I muttered, taking the money and giving him his change. "Your order will be ready in a few minutes." He didn't move to sit down or wait by the counter like most people do. Instead, he stood there, staring at me. It felt like his eyes were boring into my soul. I tried to ignore it, turning around to get his burger started. Jenny had noticed him too, and she gave me a weird look as I handed her the order slip. "You see that guy?" I whispered to her. She nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, he's giving me the creeps." I nodded back. Something wasn't right about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Jenny hurried to get the burger done, and I turned back to the counter, expecting him to still be standing there. But he was gone. For a moment, I thought he'd left the restaurant, but then I saw him. He was sitting in the corner booth, the one that's always kind of shadowed because of the flickering light above it. His back was turned to me, but I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face. Jenny came up a minute later with the burger, and I walked over to the man's booth. I placed the tray in front of him and said, "Here's your order. Enjoy." He didn't say thank you, didn't even acknowledge me. He just kept staring straight ahead, his hands resting on the table. I quickly backed away, heading for the counter, not wanting to be near him any longer than I had to. That's when the real weirdness started. I went back to my spot behind the register, trying to shake off the uneasiness. I glanced over at Jenny, and she looked just as freaked out as I felt. The man didn't touch his food. He just sat there, staring at the wall in front of him. The burger remained untouched on the tray. After about 10 minutes, I started to wonder what he was waiting for. I mean, who orders food and then just sits there, not eating it? I decided to go check on him, maybe ask if he wanted something else. As I approached the booth, I could feel my heart beating faster. Something about this guy wasn't right, and every instinct in me was screaming to leave him alone. But I forced myself to walk up to him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Is everything okay with your order?" He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. He just sat there staring blankly at the wall. I was about to repeat myself when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His reflection. The booth he was sitting in was right next to the window, and in the dim light, I could see his reflection in the glass. Except, it wasn't right. The man was sitting still, not moving, but his reflection was staring directly at me. Its eyes were wide open, dark and hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a sick, unnatural smile. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I blinked, hoping I was just seeing things, but when I looked again, the reflection was still smiling at me, even though the man hadn't moved an inch. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I rushed back to the counter where Jenny was waiting, her face pale as a sheet. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" "The reflection." It was looking at Mem. Jenny frowned and glanced over at the booth. "What are you talking about?" "He's just sitting there." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I swear his reflection was smiling at me. It wasn't normal. Jenny didn't have a chance to respond because at that moment, the man stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if every movement was calculated. He walked toward the door, his eyes never leaving the floor. But as he passed by the window, I caught one last glimpse of his reflection. It was still smiling. The man left without a word, the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. Jenny and I stood there in stunned silence, watching him disappear into the night. The restaurant felt colder after he left, and the air seemed heavy, oppressive. After a few minutes, Jenny spoke. "Do you think he's coming back?" I shook my head, not wanting to think about it. "I hope not." We never saw that man again, but sometimes when I work the late shift, I catch a glimpse of something in the windows. A smile, a reflection that doesn't quite match what's in the restaurant. And every time I do, I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting to come back. If you ever find yourself working a late night shift at McDonald's, be careful. Not every customer is what they seem. Working the late shift at McDonald's always gave me an uneasy feeling. The bright fluorescent lights flickering, casting strange shadows across the empty dining area, the eerie silence broken only by the soft hum of machines. It just felt unnatural at night. By 3 a.m., the streets outside were dead. The only company I had was my coworker, Jamie, who stayed in the back prepping for the morning shift. I was wiping down tables near the front entrance when the doorbell chimed. At this hour? Weird. Most people came in before midnight or not at all. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his presence immediately unsettling. He was tall, too tall, easily over 6 feet. He had on a black hoodie pulled low over his face, but from what I could make out, his skin was pale, almost sickly. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, the glass door slowly closing behind him, making a faint squeaking noise that hung in the air like a bad omen. "Hey man," I called out, trying to sound casual, even though my throat felt dry. "What can I get you?" The man didn't answer. He started walking, his steps unnaturally slow, the heels of his boots making heavy thuds against the tile floor. He walked past the counter, ignoring me, heading straight to the far corner of the dining area. He sat down at one of the booths by the window, where the lights barely reached, casting his face in shadows. I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to come to the counter or even look at the menu, but he didn't move. He just sat there, his back to me, staring out the window into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to look away. I'd seen strange customers before, it's part of the gig, but something about this guy felt off. I tried to shake it off, busying myself with cleaning the tables, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that his eyes were on me, even though he hadn't turned his head once. After a few minutes, I went back behind the counter, stealing glances at him between tasks. Jamie came out from the back, a rag in hand, yawning as she approached. "Someone here?" she asked, noticing my distracted look. "Yeah," I muttered, nodding toward the far booth. "That guy's been sitting there for a while now." Hasn't said a word. Jamie squinted toward him. "Weird. You think he's homeless or something?" "Maybe. I don't know. But he hasn't ordered anything. Should we ask him if he needs something?" she asked. clearly as unsettled as I was. Before I could answer, the man stood up abruptly. He didn't make a sound, but the suddenness of his movement made me flinch. He turned to face the counter, and I finally got a good look at his face. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost gray, with deep sunken eyes that seemed far too large for his gaunt face. His lips were thin and colorless, pressed into a tight line. But the worst part was his eyes. They were entirely black, with no whites or pupils, just an empty void that seemed to swallow the light around him. I stared, frozen in place, as he began walking toward us. His footsteps echoed louder than before, each step dragging out in a way that made it feel like time was slowing down. Jamie was the first to speak. "Sir, can we help you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. He stopped a few feet away from the counter, his blank eyes fixed on me. He raised one hand, pointing a long, bony finger in my direction. "You," he said, his voice low and raspy like the sound of sandpaper scraping against metal. "I need to speak with you." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. What can I get you?" I asked, trying to sound normal, though I could feel my body trembling. He shook his head slowly. "Not food, not drink." His voice felt like it was crawling inside my skull, like every word burrowed deeper into my mind. I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those horrible black eyes. "You're in danger," he whispered. "What?" I croaked, barely able to form words. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice getting quieter, almost a hiss. "It knows you're alone." I didn't understand what he meant, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. Jamie was standing beside me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave," the man said, his fingers still pointing directly at me. "Before it's too late." Before I could ask what he was talking about, the lights in the dining room flickered, plunging the room into near darkness for a few seconds. When they came back on, the man was gone, vanished. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sound of footsteps. He had simply disappeared. Jamie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Where did he go?" she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. I spun around, scanning the room. He was nowhere. The booth where he had been sitting was empty, the window beside it reflecting only the dim light inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could respond, there was a soft tapping sound. I froze, my ears straining to locate the source. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the back of the restaurant. "Jamie, do you hear Ted?" it whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. We moved slowly toward the back, where the storage room and freezer were located. The tapping continued, irregular and unsettling. It almost sounded like nails scraping on metal. As we neared the storage room, the sound stopped. Complete silence fell over the restaurant, so thick it was almost suffocating. Jamie reached for the storage room door, her hand trembling, and slowly pulled it open. There was nothing inside, just the shelves stocked with supplies and cleaning products. But the air was thick with a strange metallic smell like blood. Suddenly something crashed behind us, and we both jumped. A chair had fallen over in the dining area, but we hadn't touched it. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Without another word, we grabbed our things and bolted for the front door, locking it behind us. As we stepped outside into the cold night air, I looked back through the glass windows of the McDonald's. In the far corner where the man had been sitting, I saw it, two black empty eyes staring back at me from the booth. It was a regular Tuesday night, or at least it started that way. I was working the closing shift at McDonald's, which I had done countless times before. It was usually pretty quiet in the small town after 10 p.m., nothing much to worry about, just cleaning up and waiting for the occasional late-night customer. That night, however, I would have given anything for it to stay boring. I was alone in the front, wiping down the counters, while my coworker Steve was in the back, cleaning the kitchen area. We had about an hour left before closing, and I was mentally counting down the minutes, eager to get home. The restaurant was empty as usual, with just the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional clinking from Steve in the back. At around 11:15, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye, a man standing outside, staring in through the glass. He was positioned just at the edge of the parking lot near the street, where the streetlights barely reached. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. "Hey, Steve," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a guy outside. He's been standing there for a few minutes now. Looks kinda sketchy. Steve poked his head out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. Just some weirdo probably. You want me to go out and check? I shook my head. Nah, it's fine. Maybe he's waiting for someone to pick him up. Steve shrugged and disappeared back into the kitchen. I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced back outside. The guy was still there, standing in the same spot, but this time his head was tilted, almost as if he knew I was watching him. His face was partially hidden in the shadow of a hoodie, but I could make out enough to feel uneasy. His clothes were dirty, and his posture was unnerving, like he was swaying just slightly. I forced myself to look away and focus on finishing my tasks. Maybe he'd leave soon, I thought, but 5 minutes later when I glanced back again, he was gone. Relief washed over me for a second, until I noticed something that made my stomach drop. He wasn't gone, he had moved. He was now standing directly in front of the glass doors, staring in, inches away from me. I stumbled back, almost dropping the cleaning rag. His face was more visible now, and it was worse than I had imagined. His skin looked wrong, pale and blotchy like someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed directly on me, unblinking. His lips were chapped, cracked, and curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I hurried to the back, heart pounding in my chest. Steve. The guy's right outside the door now, staring in. Steve came rushing out, looking annoyed. What? Where is he? I pointed toward the door, but when we looked, the man was gone. Again. Steve groaned. You're probably just imagining things, man. It's late, and we've had a long shift. Maybe you're tired. I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I saw. But Steve wasn't the type to believe in anything remotely strange. He walked back to the kitchen, muttering something under his breath about overreacting. I returned to the front, still shaken, but tried to convince myself that maybe Steve was right. Maybe it was just some drunk guy messing around and he'd moved on. The next 20 minutes were quiet, too quiet. No more sign of the man, no more strange occurrences. The last few customers of the night came and went, and I started feeling a little foolish for freaking out earlier. Then at 11:45, the doorbell chimed. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. The man was inside. He had walked in without a sound, his heavy boots barely making a noise on the tiled floor. He didn't go to the counter or the kiosk. He just stood there, in the middle of the restaurant, his hood pulled down low, and his eyes, those dead, black eyes, were still fixed on me. Steve, I shouted, trying to hide the panic in my voice. He's inside. I backed up as Steve rushed out from the kitchen. What the hell, man? You again? The guy didn't answer. He just kept standing there, unmoving. Steve wasn't scared easily, but even he hesitated. There was something deeply unsettling about this guy. Something that wasn't just weird, it was wrong. Sir, we're about to close, Steve said, his voice firm but cautious. You need to leave. The man's head tilted slightly, just like he had outside, that eerie smile never leaving his face. He said nothing, didn't move, just stood there, staring. All right, you need to go now, Steve said more aggressively. He started walking toward the guy, but as he got closer, the man took one step back. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like he was daring Steve to follow him. The smile widened, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. His teeth were sharp, not just uneven, but jagged, almost like they'd been filed into points. It was subtle at first, but the more I stared, the clearer it became. Steve didn't seem to notice. He moved toward the man again, and this time, the guy bolted. But instead of running toward the exit, he darted toward the side hallway that led to the restrooms. What the hell? Steve shouted and followed him, clearly pissed off now. Steve, don't! I called after him, but it was too late. He disappeared into the hallway after the guy. I stood frozen, listening for any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything. But all I heard was silence. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, but after what felt like an eternity, Steve hadn't come back. Steve, I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I forced myself to move, my feet feeling like they were weighed down by concrete. I walked slowly toward the hallway, every instinct telling me to turn around and run. But I couldn't leave Steve. The hallway was dark, the lights dimming slightly as they sometimes did at this time of night. I crept forward, the silence suffocating. When I reached the bathroom door, it was slightly ajar. Steve, I whispered again, pushing the door open. Inside, the bathroom was empty. No Steve, no man, just the faint drip of water from the sink. But as I stepped further inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scrawled on the mirror in what looked like a dark, oily substance were the words, "He's mine now." I turned and bolted out of the bathroom, out of the restaurant, and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. I never went back to that McDonald's. And Steve, he was never found. The police said he must have run off or had an accident, but I know better. That man, whatever he was, took him. And to this day, I still see him sometimes, standing outside late at night, staring through the glass with that same twisted smile. It was late, just after 1 a.m. I had been working the night shift at McDonald's for a few months now, and while the pay wasn't great, the quiet hours after midnight made up for it. There was something almost comforting about the steady hum of the fryers and the buzz of the fluorescent lights. Most of the time, the late-night customers were just stragglers or drunk college kids looking for something to soak up the booze. But every now and then, something weird would happen. This night would take weird to a whole new level. I was wiping down the counter, the only sound being the distant hiss from the grill in the back where my coworker Maria was cleaning up. It was just the two of us on the night shift, quiet, uneventful. The kind of night you almost hope for. I glanced at the clock. It was 1:12 a.m., just a few more hours until we could close up and go home. The chime of the door startled me. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He was tall, wearing a heavy black coat despite the warm summer night, and he moved slowly, almost deliberately. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but from what I could see, something seemed off about him. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were too stiff, like he wasn't used to walking. "Welcome to McDonald's. How can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though something about him was setting off alarm bells in my head. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, staring at the menu above me. I glanced at Maria, who was wiping down a table in the back. She hadn't noticed him yet. Can I get you something?" he asked again. Without a word, the man slowly lifted his hand, pointing at the menu. His fingers stopped on the cheeseburger. "A cheeseburger, sure," I said, trying to shake the unease that was crawling up my spine. "Anything else?" He didn't answer. He just kept pointing. "Okay, 1 cheeseburger coming up." I turned around to start the order, glancing at the security camera monitor as I did. I could see the man standing perfectly still at the counter, like a statue. The image was grainy, but something about the way he looked on the camera was wrong. His shape seemed distorted, as if the edges of his body weren't quite clear, like the static from the monitor was creeping into him. I blinked and looked back at the counter. He hadn't moved. "Maria," I whispered as I walked to the back. "There's a guy out front. Something's not right with him." She frowned, putting down the rag. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. He's just off. He won't talk, and he's been standing there not moving." "Can you just take a look?" Maria sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked out to the front while I stayed in the back, nervously glancing at the camera feed. The man was still there, still standing, still staring. But now, as Maria approached the counter, his head turned ever so slightly to follow her movements. I could see her stiffen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty restaurant. The man said nothing. He didn't even acknowledge her. He just stood there, like some kind of mannequin dressed in a coat. I watched as Maria leaned over the counter slightly, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Still no response. Maria shot me a look, raising her eyebrows. I shrugged, at a complete loss for what to do. Customers had been weird before, but this guy was something else. Something felt wrong, like the air in the room had shifted, growing heavier. "Maybe just give him the cheeseburger and get him out of here," I muttered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Maria nodded and grabbed the burger from the warmer. She placed it on the counter, right in front of him. "Here you go. It's on the house. You good now?" The man didn't move, didn't react. He just stood there, staring at the burger with those dark, sunken eyes. For a second, I thought he might not even be real, like he was some kind of hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. Then, slowly, almost painfully, he reached out and took the cheeseburger in his hand. His fingers were long and bony, and they trembled slightly as they closed around the wrapper. He held it for a moment, just staring at it, before turning and walking away, without a word, without paying. Maria and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Okay, that was creepy as hell," she muttered. "Let's just hope he doesn't come back." We both tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the air was palpable. We finished cleaning up in silence, both of us keeping one eye on the front door in case the guy came back. By the time we were ready to close, it was nearly 3 a.m. I went to lock the front doors while Maria finished up in the back. As I approached the glass doors, I froze. The man was standing outside again, directly under the street lamp. He was facing the restaurant, his body half hidden in the shadows, but I could still see his face. Or at least, I thought I could. His eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, too deep. They looked like hollow pits, like there was nothing behind them. And his mouth. The corners were pulled up into a smile, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too stretched, like the skin was tearing at the edges. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. "Maria," I yelled. "He's back." She came rushing out, but when she reached the front, he was gone. "Where?" she asked, looking around. I pointed to the spot where he'd been standing, but there was no sign of him. Just the empty parking lot, illuminated by the flickering streetlight. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Maria didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, locked up the store, and practically ran to our cars. I didn't look back, too afraid that if I did, I'd see him standing there, watching. For the next few days, I tried to shake off the encounter. I told myself it was just a weird customer, just some guy trying to mess with us. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget his face. The way his eyes seemed to bore into me, like he could see right through me. And then, a week later, I saw him again. I was walking home from the bus stop late at night when I noticed someone standing at the end of my street, under a streetlight. It was him, the same man, the same black coat, the same hollow eyes. I ran the rest of the way home, locking the door behind me. I haven't seen him since, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. And every time I walk past that McDonald's, I can't help but look over my shoulder, just in case. I've worked at a McDonald's for about 2 years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it's a steady paycheck. I mostly work the closing shift, which means I'm usually there until around 2 a.m., cleaning up the place and making sure everything is ready for the morning crew. It's not a bad gig, most of the time. The worst thing I have to deal with is drunk people trying to get free food or demanding we open the lobby after hours. But something happened a few weeks ago that I still can't explain. I haven't told anyone about it, but it's been eating away at me, and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It was a typical Wednesday night. Things had slowed down by midnight, and we were just waiting for the last couple of drive-through orders to clear before we could lock up. My coworker, David, was handling the fry station while I took care of the front counter. It was quiet. The kind of night where you could hear the hum of the soda machine and the distant chatter of some late-night radio station playing in the kitchen. Around 12:30, the door chime rang, and I glanced up, surprised. The lobby had been closed for nearly an hour, and the doors should have been locked. A man had walked in. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, and dressed in a long, dark trench coat. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes were sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were old, like they were from another time, maybe the 1940s or 50s, and his shoes looked worn down, covered in dirt and grime. I froze for a second, confused about how he'd even gotten inside. I checked the doors earlier, and they were locked. No one should have been able to get in without a key. "Hey, sir, sorry, but the lobby is closed. We can help you through the drive-thru if you'd like," I called out, trying to sound polite but firm. The guy didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. His presence felt off, like he didn't belong there, like he didn't belong anywhere. David poked his head out from the kitchen, giving me a questioning look. I motioned to him, pointing at the man by the door. "Did you let him in?" David asked, walking toward me. He was clearly confused as well. "No, man. I don't know how he got in. I locked the doors earlier." David frowned and walked over to the front entrance, checking the locks. They were still secure. "Sir," David said, turning to the man, "the lobby is closed. We're going to have to ask you to leave." Again, no response. The guy just kept staring at us, his expression blank. The longer he stood there, the more uneasy I felt. It was like he wasn't really there, even though he clearly was. My gut was telling me that something was seriously wrong. Suddenly, the lights in the restaurant flickered. It wasn't a power surge or anything. It was like someone had turned them off and on quickly. The soda machine hissed, sputtering for a moment before going back to normal. The air felt colder, like someone had cranked up the AC, even though it was a warm summer night. The man finally moved. He slowly lifted his arm and pointed at the menu board behind me, his hand trembling as though it took all his effort just to make that simple gesture. "You want to order something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I felt like a complete idiot saying that, but I didn't know what else to do. The whole situation was creeping me out, and I just wanted him gone. He nodded ever so slightly, but his eyes never left mine. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. "What can I get you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed again, this time at the cash register. I glanced down, and that's when I noticed something weird. The screen on the register was frozen, displaying an old McDonald's logo from the 1980s. The rest of the system was fine, but the logo on the screen hadn't been used in years. "I think something's wrong with the register," I said to David, who was standing next to me now, equally unnerved. Before David could respond, the man let out a low, raspy breath. His shoulders heaved, and for the first time, I could see his chest rising and falling with each shallow inhale. It was like he was struggling to breathe, like every breath was a battle. "Are you okay?" David asked, his voice filled with genuine concern now. "Do you need help?" The man didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, slowly pulling out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He held it out to me, his hand shaking. I didn't want to take it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to back away, to run, to get the hell out of there. But something compelled me to reach for the paper, and as soon as my fingers touched it, the room seemed to get even colder. The paper was old, yellowed and brittle, like it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. I unfolded it, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what was written on it. It was an old McDonald's receipt. The date at the top read August 12th, 1981. The items listed were simple, 2 cheeseburgers and a coffee. The total was $2.15. But the strangest thing was the name printed at the bottom, John Jack Hollis. The name seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. David leaned over my shoulder, his face pale as he read the receipt. "That's impossible," he whispered. "That's almost 40 years old." I looked up at the man again, my heart pounding in my chest. His eyes were still locked on mine, but now there was something different in them, something almost pleading. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out the door. As soon as he was gone, the temperature in the room seemed to return to normal. The lights stopped flickering, and the register screen blinked back to life, displaying the modern McDonald's logo. David and I stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. "I'm going home," David finally said, his voice shaky. "I don't care if it's early. I'm not staying here." I didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff, locked up the restaurant, and got out of there as fast as we could. I didn't even look back. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, so I did some digging. I searched the name John Jack Hollis online, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. And I did. Jack Hollis had been a regular at our McDonald's back in the early 80s. He worked the night shift at a nearby factory and would come in almost every night for 2 cheeseburgers and a coffee. One night in August 1981, on his way home from work, he was hit by a car just a few blocks from the restaurant. He died instantly. I haven't seen the man since that night, but I still think about him every time I close up. And every now and then, when the lights flicker or the soda machine hisses for no reason, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his order. Or maybe he already got it. I never really thought much about working the night shift at McDonald's. I figured it was just another job, easy enough. Fewer customers meant less hassle. And besides, who really stops by McDonald's at 4 a.m., other than a few drunk college kids or truckers passing through town? I was wrong. It was a Wednesday night. The place was dead, as usual. My coworker, Maria, had just left to take out the trash, leaving me alone in the lobby. The smell of fries and grease clung to the air, and the hum of the machines was the only sound breaking the silence. I was wiping down the counters when I noticed something odd on the security monitors. There was a figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, just barely within the camera's frame, The person wasn't moving, just standing there, looking toward the restaurant. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could tell they were facing the building as if watching me. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, hoping they'd leave, but they didn't. I shrugged it off. Probably just someone waiting for a ride or a lost drunk trying to get their bearings. I continued wiping the counter, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. A few minutes later, Maria came back inside, looking pale. "Hey, did you see that guy outside?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yeah, I saw him on the cameras. You okay?" She nodded, but she didn't look okay. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. It was creepy. Maybe he's just drunk or something. He'll probably leave soon. I tried to reassure her, but deep down I was starting to feel uneasy too. We tried to get back to work, but every few minutes I found myself glancing at the monitor, hoping to see the figure had gone. But they hadn't. They were still standing there, completely motionless. After another half hour of this, Maria started getting really nervous. "This is freaking me out," she said. "I'm going to lock the front doors. I don't like this." I nodded, grateful for the extra precaution. She hurried to the front entrance and locked the doors. At least now, if the person decided to approach, they wouldn't be able to get in. Just as she turned back toward me, the drive-through intercom crackled to life. "Hello? Can I take your order?" I called out, my voice a little shaky. No response. "Hello?" I tried again, leaning closer to the headset. Again, nothing. Just static. I glanced over at Maria, who was staring at the security screen with wide eyes. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I looked up at the monitor. The figure was no longer in the parking lot. My stomach twisted, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe they just walked away. But if that was the case, why hadn't we seen them on any of the other cameras? It didn't make sense. The intercom crackled again. "Hello?" I called out once more, trying to keep my voice steady. This time, there was a response. But it wasn't what I was expecting. A low, raspy breathing filled the speaker, followed by a faint whisper. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it didn't sound like anything good. It sounded wrong. I ripped off the headset and turned to Maria. "I think someone's messing with us." Her face was pale, and she didn't look convinced. "That didn't sound like a prank," she said softly. Before I could respond, the intercom crackled again, this time louder and more aggressive. The static was piercing, and the sound made my skin crawl. I moved to shut off the headset, but then I heard it, clear as day, a voice on the other end. "I'm coming in." My blood ran cold. Maria and I exchanged horrified glances. She ran to check the front doors, double-checking the locks. They're locked. He can't get in. But that did little to ease my growing panic. Whoever this was clearly knew we were in here, and the fact that they'd been watching us from the parking lot made it even worse. I decided to check the cameras again. The figure was gone from the parking lot, but then something caught my eye. On one of the screens, showing the side of the building, I saw a movement. A shadow slipping around the back toward the service entrance. My heart pounded in my chest. "He's heading to the back," I whispered. Maria's face went pale as she grabbed her phone. "I'm calling the cops." While she dialed, I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, watching the shadow move closer and closer to the service door. And then, just as the figure reached the door, they disappeared from the screen. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. There was a loud bang from the back, followed by another and another. Someone was pounding on the service door. Maria was on the phone with, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation. The banging continued, more frantic now, as if whoever was out there was desperate to get in. I grabbed the nearest object, a mop handle, and stood by the kitchen entrance, my heart racing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The silence was deafening. Maria and I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. A minute passed. Then two. The only sound was the distant hum of the fryers. "I don't hear anything," Maria whispered. "Maybe he left," I suggested, though I didn't believe it for a second. We cautiously made our way toward the back, stopping just short of the service door. I leaned in, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. Nothing. Slowly I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. I wasn't sure if I was being brave or stupid, but I needed to know if the person was still out there. Just as I touched the handle, there was a loud slam from the other side, and I jumped back, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. Maria let out a stifled scream, clutching her phone tightly. "I don't think we should open that," she whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, backing away from the door. Whoever was on the other side clearly wasn't giving up easily. The pounding resumed, louder and more violent this time, and I could hear the door creaking under the pressure. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the lights flickered and went out. The entire restaurant was plunged into darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the security monitors and the occasional flash from Maria's phone as she frantically tried to get a signal. The pounding on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive, and I could hear the hinges groaning under the strain. My grip tightened on the mop handle, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "Did you get through to the cops?" I asked Maria, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're on their way," she said, her voice shaking. "But I don't know how long they'll be." Just as she said that, the pounding stopped again. Silence. The kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the machines and our own ragged breathing. And then, without warning, the service door swung open with a loud creak. But no one was there. The door just hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. The cold night air rushed in, chilling us to the bone. We stared at the open door, too terrified to move. What the hell was going on? I took a step forward, peering into the darkness beyond the door. The alley outside was empty. No sign of the person who had been banging on the door just moments ago. "Do you see anything?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my throat dry. "No, nothing." But something didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like we weren't alone. And then, from the darkness outside, I heard it. A low guttural whisper, so faint I almost didn't catch it. "I'm inside." I froze. Before I could react, the lights flickered back on, and standing just a few feet away from us was the figure. The man in the dark clothes, his face pale and twisted into a horrifying grin. His eyes were dark, empty voids that seemed to bore into my soul. Maria let out a blood-curdling scream, and I felt my legs buckle beneath me. And then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. Gone, like he was never there. The cops arrived a few minutes later, but there was nothing to find. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They chalked it up to a prank or maybe our imagination running wild. But I know what I saw. We both do. And now, every time I work the night shift, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe next time, he won't just disappear. It was my second week working the night shift at McDonald's, and things had been uneventful so far. The place was located in a small, quiet town, and other than the occasional drunk customer or late-night trucker, not much happened. Honestly, I took the job because I needed the money, but the thought of spending the dead hours alone in a fast food joint wasn't exactly thrilling. That night, the air felt different. I could feel the chill before I even stepped into the building. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the streets were empty, eerily empty. I shrugged it off as just another slow night. My manager, Tom, had left early, leaving me to close up by myself. He trusted me enough, or maybe he just didn't care. It was around midnight when the first odd thing happened. I was mopping the floor near the back when I heard the soft ding from the front counter. Someone had just walked in. Surprised, I looked up. Who the hell comes into a McDonald's at midnight? The man standing by the counter was tall, unnervingly thin, with his hood pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes, just the faint outline of his nose and mouth under the dim lights. His clothes looked old, ragged even, but I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just another traveler passing through. "Hey, welcome to McDonald's," I said, trying to sound cheerful, though my voice wavered a bit. "What can I get you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, unmoving, just staring at me, or at least I think he was staring at me. It was hard to tell with his face partially hidden. "Sir, can I help you?" Still nothing. My skin started to prickle with unease. The man was unsettling, but I told myself he was probably just some weirdo. We got all kinds of strange customers late at night. No big deal, right? Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke. His voice was low, raspy, like he hadn't used it in days. Coffee. Black. Sure, I replied quickly, relieved he had actually spoken. One black coffee coming you up, E. As I prepared the coffee, I could feel his eyes, or whatever was under that hood, on me the entire time. My hands were shaking slightly, but I managed to get the cup to him without spilling it. He took it without a word and sat down at one of the booths, facing away from me. I tried to go back to mopping, but something about the man unnerved me. Every few seconds, I found myself glancing at him. He just sat there, not drinking the coffee, not moving, just sitting, like he was waiting for something. But what? About half an hour passed, and I started to relax a little. Maybe he was just a loner, one of those guys who likes to sit in the quiet, drink his coffee, and think. It wasn't until I checked the security cameras that things got weird again. I saw him, not the man inside, but someone else, outside, in the parking lot. Another figure standing perfectly still near the edge of the lot, just staring at the building. The camera feed was grainy, but I could tell it was someone wearing dark clothes, similar to the man inside. My stomach tightened. Was it just a coincidence, or were they together? I switched between the cameras, hoping for a clearer view. The person outside didn't move. They stood there for another few minutes, then slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. Maybe it was just someone passing by. No big deal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced over at the man in the booth. He still hadn't touched his coffee. The rest of the night passed quietly. No one else came in, and the man eventually got up and left without a word, leaving the full cup of coffee behind. I watched him walk out the door, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was taking his time. I locked the doors behind him, feeling a strange sense of relief that he was gone. But as I turned to head back to the kitchen, I heard it, the soft ding of the door sensor, indicating someone had entered. But the door was locked. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The lobby was empty. The door hadn't opened. There was no one there. I quickly walked back to the counter, checking the security footage again. Nothing. The lot was empty, and the man had left. There was no sign of anyone else around. But that feeling of being watched, of something lingering in the air, wouldn't leave. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the door sensor malfunctioned. Maybe I was just on edge from the strange encounter with the man. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the night felt wrong. I could feel it in my bones. An hour later, I started closing down for the night. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows harder than before, and the fluorescent lights in the kitchen flickered every so often. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I finished up and headed toward the back door to take out the trash. I had my hand on the door handle when I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a noise, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the kitchen. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it, a shadow, darker than the others, moving across the floor just beyond the counter. It was low, almost crawling, but there was nothing there to cast it. No source of light or object. It was just there. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I quickly finished taking out the trash and locked up the restaurant as fast as I could, my heart racing the entire time. As I stepped outside into the cold night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. I glanced back at the building, expecting to see something or someone watching me from the windows. But there was nothing. I hurried to my car, not daring to look back again until I was safely inside. As I drove home, the image of the shadow crawling across the floor played over and over in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination running wild after a strange night. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning I told Tom about what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was being paranoid. But instead, he just looked at me with a strange expression, like he knew exactly what I was talking about. "You're not the first one to see something like that," he said quietly. "There's been incidents, weird stuff. Shadows, figures in the parking lot. No one likes working the night shift for long." He didn't say anything more, but that was enough. I quit the job the next day. I still drive by that McDonald's sometimes, but I never stop. Even during the day, the place gives me the creeps. There's something off about it, something dark lurking just out of sight. And I'll never forget the way that shadow moved across the floor, like it was a live eye. Thought leaving McDonald's behind would be enough to put the unsettling experiences to rest, but the shadows of that night continued to haunt me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that place. A few weeks after quitting, I started experiencing strange occurrences at home. It began with small things, lights flickering, strange noises at odd hours. I brushed them off as coincidences or my own heightened anxiety. After all, I was working late shifts, and the exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. But then, things started to escalate. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my hallway. My apartment was small, so it was clear that the footsteps were coming from inside, not outside. I lay in bed, holding my breath, listening as the steps grew louder and closer. I peered out from under the covers, but I saw nothing, just the dark, empty hallway. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there was no one there, and nothing seemed out of place. Another night, I found my door unlocked when I knew I'd locked it before bed. I checked the locks several times, convinced they were malfunctioning, but each time I made sure they were secure. Yet, they continued to be found unlocked. And I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few friends mentioned feeling an unsettling presence when they came over, something they couldn't quite explain but made them uneasy. Despite my efforts to ignore the disturbances, I couldn't escape the memories of that night at McDonald's. I even started to avoid driving past the restaurant, taking different routes to avoid the sight of it. It was as if the place had become a dark spot on my life's map, one I couldn't erase. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself wandering the internet, looking for any mention of similar experiences. I stumbled across a forum dedicated to paranormal occurrences and decided to post my story. I didn't expect much, just a place to vent and maybe find some reassurance. To my surprise, I received several replies almost immediately. Some were sympathetic, others were skeptical, but a few were unsettlingly familiar. They described experiences that matched mine almost perfectly. Shadowy figures, strange noises, and eerie presences that seemed to follow them from place to place. One user under the handle Nightwalker88 mentioned working at a fast food restaurant in a different town and having similar encounters. They had described shadows moving across the floor, unaccounted for figures, and even the unsettling feeling of being watched. The similarities were uncanny, and the user's experience ended with them quitting their job under mysterious circumstances. Intrigued and a little unnerved, I sent Nightwalker88 a private message, asking for more details. They responded quickly, sharing their story in more depth. According to them, their restaurant had been built on land with a troubling history, a place where strange things had happened long before it was a McDonald's. They had experienced unexplained phenomena during their shifts and later discovered that the land was known locally for its dark past. I decided to dig deeper. I researched the history of the land where my McDonald's was located. To my horror, I found that the area had once been home to a factory that had a reputation for strange occurrences and accidents. There were tales of workers vanishing without a trace and whispers of hauntings. The more I uncovered, the more convinced I became that the restaurant was not just haunted, it was a conduit for something darker. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I returned to McDonald's during the day when it was open. The restaurant seemed normal, bustling with activity, but the memories of the night shifts lingered. I approached Tom, who was still managing the place. "Hey Tom," I started cautiously. "I've been doing some research about the building. Do you know anything about its history?" Tom's face grew serious, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, maybe fear. He hesitated before responding. "Look, I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to scare you," Tom said quietly. "There have been incidents before, employees quitting, strange things happening. I don't know all the details, but I've heard stories. Some people believe it's the land, others think it's something else." His words only confirmed what I had feared. There was more to the place than just a bad night. The shadows, the feeling of being watched, and the unsettling experiences at home were all connected. I decided to leave well enough alone. Sometimes ignorance is bliss. I continued with my life, trying to ignore the lingering sense of dread that followed me. I made sure to avoid McDonald's and took extra precautions to secure my home. The disturbances in my apartment eventually ceased, though the feeling of being watched never completely went away. I could still feel the shadows of that night creeping into my thoughts from time to time. Every so often, I see a McDonald's ad or commercial and feel a shiver run down my spine. I can't help but wonder if there are others out there experiencing the same unsettling phenomena, or if the shadows have moved on to a new location waiting for their next victim. The memories of that night at McDonald's will always linger, a dark reminder of the things that hide just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge.